The future arrived as it so often does, with brutal killing. So the chronicles of the times tell us. The warriors of the village chief Torecha, some 600 men in all, made a desperate but futile effort to protect the hills of the Sierra del Quareca and were slaughtered after a short skirmish. Then the victorious looted the gold in the chief's village. Finally, they imposed the law of their god, literally feeding gay men they discovered dressed in women's clothes to the dogs. Like all imperial conquest, this expedition followed a familiar script: killing, plunder, religious fanaticism. Early one morning, a few days later, in late September 1513, Captain Vasco Nunez de Balboa saw the promised land he had been seeking, the Pacific Ocean. The implications of the short expedition Balboa had made from the Atlantic to the Pacific were immediately apparent. Alvaro de Saavedra Cerón, one of the captain's lieutenants, immediately proposed building a canal cutting along the expedition's land route so ships could sail from Spain to India without encountering the enormous dangers of rounding the southern tip of Latin America. For 5 centuries, though, as empires rose and fell, that idea would prove impossible to realize. Then, a great empire finally drove through the canal, ushering in a new era. But now it's starting to look like the story isn't quite over. Hi, and thank you for joining this episode of ThePrint Explorer. 25 years ago, this very week, the United States handed over the administration, operation, and maintenance of the Panama Canal to Panama. Ahead of the anniversary, though, President elect Donald Trump has threatened to demand the Panama Canal be returned to America. Trump claimed the canal was foolishly given to Panama and said he would not let it fall into the wrong hands, a reference quite obviously to China. For his part, Panamanian President Jose Raul Mulino has responded to Trump's threats by saying every square meter of the canal and its adjacent zone belongs to Panama and will continue to do so. The sovereignty and independence of our country are not negotiable. Through American eyes, though, Panama is American and must stay American. And that, the tiny country, is set to become one of the great sites of geopolitical competition in the second Trump presidency. Little imagination is needed to understand the logic behind Trump's threats. Chinese companies have positioned themselves at either end of the Panama Canal through port concession agreements. In 2016, in a $900 million deal, the China-based Landbridge Group acquired control of Margarita Island, Panama's largest port on the Atlantic side. China also has large equities in the Colón Free Trade Zone, the largest free trade zone in the Western Hemisphere. The deal established the Panama Colón container port as a deep water port for megaships, and the construction and expansion was carried out by the China Communications Construction Company, a corporation which is also active in China's island building program in the South China Sea. Hong Kong-based Hutchinson today controls 2 of Panama's 5 principal canal zone ports, with one on each side of the Panama Canal. Chinese companies are finishing work on a cruise ship terminal and are working to construct a 4th bridge over the canal. Everywhere in Panama, as in so much else of the world, the influence of Beijing is evident. China is today Panama's second largest trading partner after the United States. The earlier administration of President Juan Carlos Varela, when it pivoted towards China in 2017, had hoped to secure a $4 billion high-speed railway line, a $1 billion port investment, and $1 billion natural gas power plant, in addition to what China was already pumping into the country's economy. These projects were abandoned by the more China-skeptic or pro-American government of President Laurentino Cortizo. But let's face it, money talks no matter who rules. Even if we can understand the strategic anxieties underlying Trump's remarks, some of the facts of this case are a little bit puzzling. Fees to transit the Panama Canal have indeed gone up, partly because drought conditions led to the number of transits being temporarily restricted back in 2023. That meant a system of auctions was put in place for transits. Although base costs for each transit is very similar to those at the Suez Canal in Egypt, another key waterway, auction prices obviously vary wildly and can be very, very expensive. The Panama Canal Authority has kept the auction system in place even though the droughts have ended and transit can now take place normally. Panama obviously sees the auction system as a way of raising revenues, and if the demand exists, it's entitled to charge the premium. Fees are pretty much the same for all ships of all countries, though, whether they're China or the United States, though, of course, much of the traffic is intended for the United States. The entire revenue generated by the canal, though, is just some $5 billion last year, which, given the scale of commerce passing through it, isn't that much money, and certainly not a punitive load for the United States bound carriers, or United States consumers. So, why the fuss? To understand the story requires engaging with the fact that control of Panama was key to America's emergence as a superpower in the first place. In 1823, President James Monroe laid out a blueprint for American foreign policy to the American Congress. The Monroe Doctrine, as it came to be called, announced the end of European imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. In essence, the Monroe Doctrine stated that the United States would not tolerate further European backed colonization or puppet monarchs in its hemisphere. And that meant the United States replaced European powers like Great Britain and Spain as the continental hegemon. The Monroe Doctrine was later to lead the United States into multiple interventions across Latin America through the 20th century as it battled the Soviet Union. And now, as it battles China, the Panama Canal is, if you like, the final red line. Remember the story of Captain Vasco Nunez de Balboa and how greed led him to shed blood 500 years ago? Even if Trump doesn't read a lot of history, the story itself he probably understands. In his Christmas Day speech, Trump claimed that there were People's Liberation Army troops guarding China's assets in the Panama Canal and said that this violated treaty agreements not to have foreign military forces in the area. There isn't a lot of evidence to back up President elect Trump's claims. Who knows, it may or may not be true that there are some PLA linked personnel there, but the fundamental point is unmistakable. To many in the United States strategic establishment, it seems like China is encroaching on the doorstep of America. And that's about as much of a threat as a strategic threat can be. Let's go back to the story of how the canal was built to understand just how much of a prize it really was and why it involves equities bigger than just money. Emperor Charles V of Spain responded very enthusiastically to that 1513 proposal for a canal through Panama. He sent 3 expeditions down the Chagres River to scout possible routes in between 1529 and 1533. The third of those expeditions returned a positive report from an explorer called Gaspar de Espinosa. He wrote, "The Chagres can be made navigable at a very small cost. A channel for navigation could be dredged." Administrators on the ground, though, were quite unimpressed. Charles V received a letter from one of his administrators in Panama saying advice to build a canal was being given, I quote, by a man of very scant intelligence who has travelled and understood very little of this land. There is not a prince in the world with the power to accomplish this, the letter read. The Spanish again proposed canal projects in 1552, in 1600, and in 1620, but nothing came of them because the technology simply didn't exist. For reasons God best understood, he'd put 2 great mountain ranges between the Pacific and the Atlantic, and that wasn't something men at that point could do very much about. What did exist, though, were technologies to build roads linking the two oceans. In 1525, the Spanish under Governor Pedro Arias connected Panama City on the Pacific coast with Nombre de Dios on the Atlantic. The government called this route the Cal de Santo Domingo. A second route covered 15 miles from Panama City to the Chagres River at Las Cruces. From there, goods could be transported by boat. To build these roads itself was no small task. The climate took a terrible toll of lives. The Spanish responded by shipping in slave labor from Nicaragua. There are no accurate figures for the numbers enslaved to build the roads, but estimates run to a peak of 100,000 people for 1535 and 1536. A very large percentage of them simply died of illness. For a variety of reasons, though, these transoceanic roads never became a gold mine, at least in the way some had expected. Economic historians Noel Maurer and Charles Carlos Yu, who have a fantastic book on the Panama Canal, argue that poor roads, imported inputs to build them, and low competition retarded the economic opportunity. Transcoast transits, notably, cost much more than other comparable mule routes across Spanish America. It cost 13 times as much per unit of weight to travel the 50 miles along the Royal Road from Panama City to Portobello as it cost to take cargo 500 miles from Potosi to Huancavelica. Even more astoundingly, mule transport across Panama cost 47 times as much as the Acapulco to Veracruz mule route in Mexico. That obviously meant that the roads had stiff competition elsewhere and didn't draw as much traffic as they might have. Then, from the 17th century, came another series of death blows to the interocean road. The first was Spain's growing military weakness. Spanish colonial territory proved much more porous to foreign incursion than it appeared on a map, and Spanish wealth presented foreign powers with a very tempting target. In famous raids, the English pirate Henry Morgan sacked Portobello in 1667 and the city of Panama in 1671. The Royal Navy again destroyed Portobello in 1739. The second factor was the slow collapse of Peru's silver mining economy. The Potosi mines peaked around 1610. Other mines came online, but Peru's overall silver production declined 83% between 1611 and 1714 in just a century. Spain's royal income from Peru declined commensurately. As silver output and royal income fell, so did the transit trade through Panama. The third factor in Panama's commercial decline was competition. Goods could be carried very much more cheaply via the Rio de la Plata and carried overland to Peru and onto the Pacific Ocean. Even these economic blows, though, didn't kill the idea of an interocean canal. The German polymath Alexander von Humboldt revived the idea of a canal across the Panamanian Isthmus in his writings in 1811. Humboldt examined 9 routes in the Americas and focused in on the Panamanian Isthmus. Goods sent through the isthmus, he remarks, would cross at less expense and in less danger, particularly in times of war. The productions of Nootka Sound and of China, that is, in the Pacific, will be brought more than 2,000 leagues nearer to Europe and the United States, Humboldt observed. The geography of Panama also fired the imagination of Simon Bolivar, the legendary South American revolutionary and nation builder. In a famous letter from Jamaica in 1815, Bolivar enthused, "How beautiful it would be if the Isthmus of Panama could be for us what Corinth was for the Greeks," Corinth being the port and economic powerhouse on which Hellenic civilization was founded. The idea of a canal across the isthmus also sparked the imaginations of some of the greatest minds of Europe. Johann Wolfgang Goethe, the philosopher, dining with his friend Eckermann in February 1827, gave a prescient extension of Humboldt's analysis. Foreseeing the growth of great commercial cities on the American Pacific coast, he mused, "I should wonder if the United States were to let an opportunity escape of getting such a work in their own hands. It is absolutely indispensable for the United States to effect a passage from the Mexican Gulf to the Pacific Ocean. And in fact, while Goethe was thinking about this, so were Americans. William Duane, a Spanish speaking Philadelphia lawyer, visited Gran Colombia in 1822 and 1823 to pursue some compensation related litigation against the Colombian government on behalf of some American clients. Along the way, he became taken with, I quote, the grand work of the Strait of Panama, to effect which I have made proposals to the Colombian government sustained by capitalists, and which, if it accomplished as I know it is practicable, would render the communications between the two oceans as free and more secure than the passage of the Straits of Sunda or Gibraltar. In August 1849, a former New York ferryman named Cornelius Vanderbilt, not yet the man who would become America's richest, obtained the rights from the Nicaraguan government to build a canal through its territory. Vanderbilt's company had to complete the work within 12 years, according to their contract. In August 1850, Vanderbilt sent an agent, Orville Childs, to Nicaragua to plan the canal route. Childs had earlier worked on the Erie Canal enlargement, that is, along the Great Lakes in the United States, and brought back with him a team of 14 engineers. The result was the first serious plan for a lock canal which could accommodate ships with a 17-foot draft. That particular canal never got built, but a single line railroad was constructed instead, hammered through the terrain by migrant workers from China and the West Indies. From 1849 to 1871, the Trans-Nicaragua Rail Line provided a shortcut to send gold mined in California to America's East Coast cities, especially New York. The end of the gold rush saw the strategic significance of the rail line decline. Even then, the idea of a canal didn't go away, but it would take a rising new empire to give the builders the muscle, technology, and money that they needed. In 1850, the United States and Great Britain negotiated the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, hoping to prevent rivalry between themselves over proposals to push the canal through the Republic of Nicaragua. The Anglo-American Canal never went beyond the planning stages. French attempts to build a canal through Panama, then a province of Colombia, advanced a lot further. Led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, the builder of the Suez Canal in Egypt, the French began excavating in 1880. Malaria, yellow fever, and other tropical diseases, though, conspired against the de Lesseps project, and after 9 years and a loss of an incredible 20,000 lives, the French attempt went bankrupt. In spite of the failure of the French, American interest in the canal continued. In 1901, the earlier treaty, the Anglo-American Treaty, was abrogated, and the United States acquired a license to build and manage its own canal. Following heated debate over where the location of that canal should be exactly, in 1902, the United States Senate voted in favor of putting the canal through Panama. Within 6 months, Secretary of State John Hay signed a treaty with Colombian Foreign Minister Tomás Herrán to build the new canal. The financial terms that were offered, though, proved unacceptable to Colombia's parliament, and it rejected the offer. And that's where great power pulled the glove off its iron fist. President Theodore Roosevelt responded by dispatching United States warships to Panama City in Colón in support of Panamanian independence from Colombia. Colombian troops were unable to negotiate the jungles of the Darien, and Panama declared independence on November 3rd, 1903. The newly declared Republic of Panama immediately named Philippe Bonau Varela, a French engineer who'd been involved in the de Lesseps Canal, as envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to negotiate with America. In his new role, Bonau Varela negotiated the Hay-Bonau Varela Treaty of 1903, which provided the United States with a 10-mile wide strip through Panama for the canal, in return for a one-time payment of $10 million and an annuity of $250,000. American engineers finally completed the canal in 1914, 11 years after they began work. To succeed where other empires had failed, they had not only to excavate earth but defeat disease, ensure a steady flow of capital, and demonstrate never seen before technological ingenuity. There's a great overview of the technical challenges by the engineering scholar J. David Rogers. If you're interested, you can find the links in the text version of this episode of Explorer. For 5 years after the SS Ancon became the first ship to pass through the canal on the 15th of August 1914, there was very little traffic on the canal. Today, though, it's arguably the greatest artificial artery of trade in our world. Figures tell us just how important the Panama Canal is to world and particularly American trade. 14% of all United States exports and imports transit through these waters, along with 5% of the trade of Japan. Latin American countries are even more dependent. Even a partial shutdown of the canal of the kind caused by the drought in 2023 increases the time of transit from Eastern Asia to the east coast of the United States from 26 days to 39 days. And that's not counting the money. Trump signaled America means to keep charge of this treasured asset. But exactly how he means to do that in a changing world isn't clear. American complaints of greater Chinese influence in Panama are true, but also evade over reality. The fact is, China is an ever bigger investor in the American economy and American infrastructure, as well as a host of other countries. Panamanians rightly ask why their country can't benefit from Chinese investment in the same way that America does. To Americans, though, the prospect that China might one day have a chokehold over the Panama Canal or be positioned to hurt America at a time of crisis involves risks the superpower simply cannot accept. There's no telling how this drama will play out. Part of it will be linked to what Trump's China policy finally is in his second term of office. Exactly how far he's willing to go to keep China out of Panama remains to be seen. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor to ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of The Print Explorer.